Hello and welcome to a special episode of Fault Lines, recorded live here at the Reagan National Defense Forum as part of our special series. I'm Jessica Jones and I'm joined today by Martha Miller. And we have a very special guest, Sharon Weinberger, who is joining us. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk a little bit about your background, which is so impressive. You are National Security and Foreign Policy Editor at the Wall Street Journal. You just moderated an amazing panel here at RNDF. You've also served as the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for Yahoo News, Executive Editor for Foreign Policy Magazine. You've written three books on a wide array of topics. So I'm just going to dive right in, if that's okay.
That'd be great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. To kick us off, I'd love for our listeners to learn a little bit more about you. What got you started in journalism? How did you, decide to focus on national security, and what's kind of kept you in that space?
So after graduate school, which I did in the now, I think, almost near existent field, maybe making a comeback in Russian and East European studies, after graduate school, I went out and looked for work in the 90s and ended up for a couple years working for non-governmental organizations and decided it was a little bit of a self-licking ice cream cone of NGOs teaching other NGOs how to make other NGOs in Eastern Europe. And so this is aging me a lot. I opened up the Washington Post and looked at the classified ads for jobs, and I came across one for a company called SPC for a research analyst, and I thought, I can do research, I can analyze. And I showed up at the company not knowing, so sort of like internet was there but not really there, and I didn't know what the company did. It had an acronym, and I picked up the brochure while I was waiting for my interview, and it said SPC, Finding Better Ways to Wage War and Protect the Peace. So I was applying at a defense contractor, and it ended up being great. So actually a connection here to the Reagan Forum. So the person I interviewed with was Dov Zakheim, who had been a comptroller and went on to become a comptroller in the Pentagon, and he had been in the administration previously, but he was running a small research group at the company, doing studies, among other things, for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I was a young research analyst and was assigned to look at the Department of Defense laboratory system. And this was 1999, so coming up to the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review. And I was sent out without knowing anything to a whole bunch of DoD and DOE laboratories. And I just was immediately fascinated. I was fascinated by this world of science and technology and national security, and also by some of the bizarreness of it, but also the inefficiencies of it, of people trying to do really good work. But this was still sort of the tail end of the peace dividend. They were underfunded, they couldn't recruit people. And I just became really interested in the field. Like, this is a tremendous amount of money, it's of tremendous importance, and people aren't paying attention to it. So Dr. Zakheim ended up going into the Pentagon, and I wanted to stay in writing. And so, again, I don't know if it was maybe by then I was on the internet, and I saw a job at Aviation Week covering defense and aerospace. And I'm like, I like to interview people, I like to write, I like to think about these issues. And so I ended up getting a job there covering the Pentagon. And for the first, I know I started in August 2001. I'm like, this is a quiet place. And then on the morning of September 11th, I think it was the cubicle next to me was the New York Times, and I heard the DV talking about at the time they were saying it's a passenger plane into the World Trade Center, then another one. I remember thinking, like, wow, I wonder if they're going to hit Washington. And then I heard a boom. So immediately, I was very already interested in the areas of science and technology and national security, and then 9/11 gave it this new importance and also an influx of funding into this area. And I saw both tremendous progress in some areas of innovation in science and technology, and also a lot of things that didn't change, and a lot of sort of funding that probably shouldn't have gone to areas it got funded. And I felt like nobody was really covering what was seemingly a niche area, but a really important area, which is how is science and technology done in the national security community? Why is it done? Its goals are different than the NIH, it's different than NSF, but it's still really important, really important. At the time, now it sort of seems obvious to say that, but at the time I didn't feel that those questions were being asked. And so a lot of my career has been, as a journalist, now I manage a whole team at the Journal, but as a journalist, that has been the driving sort of force of inquiry for me, is how do we get innovation and how do we do good science and produce good technology for national security.
Well, and on that note, speaking of technology and modernization, what are your recommendations as to how the U.S. can strengthen its defense industrial base at this time?
I always say that journalists are really good at problematizing, figuring out what's wrong. We are terrible at solutionism. So I can talk about some of the things that are wrong. I can talk about some of the solutions I've heard. I think one of the biggest changes that we've all seen, and I spoke a little bit about this on the panel, is for the first like decade, 15 years that I covered defense, it was the same companies, the same program. So it was sort of the aftermath of the Last Supper and consolidation. And so you'd go to every defense conference and it would be the same, five primes and others, of course, as well, often talking about the same programs. And I don't think these companies are bad or good or whatever. They're trying, pretty much anybody working in national security is trying to do the best job they can, but clearly like something isn't working. And now what you've seen, and you see it visually here at the Reagan Forum, is companies like Palantir, who went from like having doors slammed in their face when they were starting off in 2003, 2004 to like being like the major force here at the conference. And that's such a change. But where does that actually matter? And that's a more complicated picture. So I think it is great that you have all of these startups in the defense field, and it's changing the defense industrial base in real time. I think where it's going to have to ultimately be judged, and this is where I think we're still quite early. I've always sworn I will never use the term warfighter. It still is a weird term for me. But let's say the user, the people in the field, when these technologies from startups are actually being used by the military in conflicts. And I know, and I'm sure that companies can give you cases where that's happening, but I actually think we're still kind of in the early stages of that. You can point to examples, but I think it's going to be in another 10 years where we see like, is this innovation, is this new defense industrial base providing us what we need? And maybe actually even just saying it out loud, maybe like 10 years isn't the point. If the point is that innovation is needed faster, maybe we should start asking in a year or two, are these solutions, are these technologies actually getting to people who are using them, and are they better? Are they innovative? I think like with everything, it's not going to be a simple answer. But it is, as I said, it's the first time, the past few years is the first time where like you really see things changing in real time, where that ends up. So anyway, to the solution part, which I've avoided because I've always said that journalists, we have, it's like probably why we're in journalism. We like to describe problems and not solve them. So let me talk about the solution from, and I really give this from a journalist perspective. I think if I'm not one who should be advising DoD on how to change their procurement system, I certainly shouldn't be advising, VCs on how to invest in companies. But I can tell you what I think I would look for as a journalist, and hopefully what, those involved in our government and making these decisions should look for, is that are these products, technologies, systems, AI, are they making it to the people that need to use them? And are they really better? I think some will be a lot better. Some may not be better, but we need to have, it's very easy to get into sort of a cheerleading phase. Like, we got startups are great. Silicon Valley is great. Silicon Valley is innovative. It's another thing to do what I think journalists covering the defense sector have done for, the 2 decades I've been involved in it. Are things over budget? Do they work? What are the problems? One of the things that I was speaking to a former executive of a startup a while back, said, part of the problem is, right now a lot of things are in the development stage, and program offices are incentivized, just like they've always been, whether it's the F-22, F-35, or anything else. They're incentivized also with startups to say everything is great, it's wonderful. And that's where we really have to focus on, is this stuff being used? How is it being used? How is it better? So I can tell you about that part. I think we need better, I've always argued for that, better transparency not cheerleading. I think cheerleading is great, but I think it can also lead to some not great things. I'm probably not the best person to talk about. Probably the companies are probably the best to talk about the regulatory environment, the procurement environment, and how to get where they need to be.
And then just kind of along those lines, I know our team read your piece about how tech bros think they can, win the war with China. And you talk about this influx in these new defense tech companies. We see the banners here at RNDF with a lot of, cool sounding names and technologies. For you reporting on this and tracking it, when did you see this shift and this influx of interest and the startups? And why do you think so many more folks are drawn into this space now? And
So I think there's a lot of, I don't know when did I first start noticing it? I've probably gone to more defense trade shows and arms shows than any person should have in their lifetime. And I would always go into those shows and people get overwhelmed by them. And I'm looking at them very differently than a Pentagon official would or an industry official. I'm looking for what's new? What trend do I see that I didn't see the year before? So I'm trying to remember, there was some point, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, where you had sort of the early companies like Palantir who were out there early. But at some point, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, you started looking around. You're like, wow, there are significantly new companies here trying to do different things, not from the traditional defense industrial base. So, sorry, that was the first part of my question. What was the second part?
why do you think they're...
Well, what?
Yeah.
Well, so that's I can tell you what other people tell me.
Okay.
I wish I don't quite have a total theory of the case. So some of it that I've heard from people interviewing people in the VC world is there aren't a lot of unicorns left anymore. There isn't the next software app, the next Uber, the next Airbnb to invest in, and so they're looking for something new. And the defense sector is something new. It's recession proof, which is a big advantage. And they see it's a tremendous amount of money. I think there was a lot of trailblazing from Elon Musk, SpaceX, from Palantir, and then a little bit later from Anduril. I think they paved the way, but I think the market forces were coming anyway. Another theory that I've heard that I think, sorry, I don't know that there's a theory of the world here, is that as, in the tech world in Silicon Valley, as companies saw the China market being, there was once great enthusiasm, like China, 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 we're going to sell to China. And as that went away, both the enthusiasm for sort of commercial involvement with China went away, and also kind of like what do you call it, like a response to it. Okay, so maybe China isn't the great friend marketplace. Maybe they are the problem. Maybe we should be investing in things to counter China. I think that's a contributing factor. I think that's a little bit too simplistic. I think it's a mix of all of these factors creating a storm. I also think on the bigger picture, you heard Pentagon officials talking as far back. I think it was sort of inevitable. So back in, when did we hear it? Probably like the 2011, 12 timeframe, maybe a couple years earlier, you started hearing Pentagon officials say what is sort of obvious now, which is that the font of capital for innovation is no longer coming from the Pentagon. When DARPA funded the first computer science departments, the ARPANET, computer networking, they were the game in town. It was DoD. There was nobody else. Now, when you have Pentagon agencies, whether DARPA or anyone else, saying we want to invest in AI, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the private sector can bring. So I think there were rumblings already a decade ago saying okay, we can't drive the tech base the way we once could. So how do we leverage it? And so you saw efforts as well by Ash Carter to build bridges to Silicon Valley as a metaphor, not necessarily geographical, though both really. So I think there was a confluence of interests of the Pentagon realizing there's so much money available in the private equity, venture capital, private capital world, and that world realizing, okay, they don't really have the money to invest in product development, but they have a pretty awesome procurement budget. It's a lot of money. And so I don't know that there's a theory of the world. I think there was a confluence of a lot of factors. Now, one thing to keep in mind there that I think is really interesting is, the relationship between the Pentagon and tech and Silicon Valley is not new. I mean, people kind of know the history, know the Pentagon sort of helped create Silicon Valley with their investments. And so this is sort of a renewal of those ties. I mean, there were always, obviously the space sector, there were always big ties. But it's a different dynamic now, and this is one that I think is interesting to watch, which is back when the Pentagon was funding the companies that sort of helped create the modern Silicon Valley. Once again, it was the gorilla, it was the everything. Now these companies they're funding it themselves and trying to sell to the Pentagon. It puts them in a different category and more influence. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just different. And it's something to look out for. Like, where does this go? So part of I will say I did not choose the Tech Bros headline.
It was catchy.
That's what headline writers do. But I think
so. You don't get to choose all your own headlines.
No, we sort of get veto.
Interesting, a little.
Yeah. Yeah. But look, I mean, I think it. Some people don't like the tech bro term, but I think it does sort of encapsulate something. I think these companies, as you could see from Dr. Karp, they have views on the world. They have views on who the enemy is and who the threat is, and they're very vocal about it. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just interesting. Let's see where all that goes. I don't know. It's going to be fascinating.
You have a lot of stories from that.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, speaking of threats, what is your take on the U.S.'s strategy towards China? And specifically, as somebody who thinks about national security technology, how do you view the U.S.-China tech competition?
So that's a tough one. I guess I feel like I've been in this loop for 24 years. So going back to my early career, I remember waiting for the Quadrennial Defense Review to come out. So this was 2001, and I'm probably getting the chronology slightly wrong, but literally it was drafted, and I've been a lot of people have been leaked copies of the draft, and it was all about China, China, China. And then the attacks of 9/11 happened, and literally they, rewrote parts of the Quadrennial Defense Review. And so China had been kind of pushed into the background for a while. So fast forward to the National Defense Strategy, everything that's going on. I started at the Journal about 3 years ago, and when I was interviewing for the job, they said, look, a lot of what you're going to be doing and focusing on is the U.S.-China relationship. I'm like, okay, sounds good. By the time I started, which I think was February 4th, Ukraine was ramping up, and suddenly my Russian East European Studies degree, I studied Ukrainian. That's pretty useful now. And it pushed again on the China issue. So obviously you've seen and you hear it here. Pentagon officials, industry officials are very focused on that. I think that we've seen the Pentagon and the U.S. sort of delayed in that shift. I think if we take it down a level, I think it's going to be difficult to explain to the American public, and I think we saw that with some of the polling and survey data that we've seen discussed, to really explain to the American public that this is our number one threat. And one of the things I tried to push on in my panel is okay, we want to talk about biotechnology, the threat of, talk about the threat, because I don't think a lot of people are hearing it. There are some also budget realities. We are facing a land war in Europe that we are not fighting ourselves, but that we are funding and providing weaponry for and cannot provide it fast enough. It's shown weaknesses in our defense industrial base. We have, as we sit here speaking, you're seeing reports that Assad is going to fall maybe today. That is going to affect U.S. national security, not to mention, Lebanon, Gaza, everything that's going on, what happens with Iran. And so the Pentagon is still saying China is the number one threat, but the reality is that we're having to deal with multiple threats. And you can call one a pacing threat, and you can call something else. It doesn't matter what you call it. There's some realities on the ground. There's some realities of our ability to produce arms and just attention span. So I think the problem of China is twofold. I think for the next administration trying to articulate why this needs to be a focus, if they believe that. I think they probably do. And then what you do about it, given all the other threats you're facing. That's the real difficult part.
And I just want to squeeze in one last question because the National Security Institute, which Fault Lines is the podcast for, has focused on global oppression this year. And you manage a team of reporters yourself. Have you seen over the years, and as you manage your team, changes in how journalists are treated, globally, freedom of the press, detentions, arrests? Of course, the Wall Street Journal had their own reporter arrested, detained, sentenced, but released earlier this year. How does your team manage these risks? How do you guys think about it?
I think people are thinking about it a lot more right now. I mean, we've seen sort of a gradual devolution in how journalists are treated on multiple levels. The threats to, sort of the arrest of Evan Gershkovich in Russia and his detainment, completely unjust detainment. But it's the killing of journalists, detainment around the world. We saw one of the concerns I think journalists are thinking about again is under the last administration. There were, you didn't see reporters' records being subpoenaed. And I'm not putting this is a bipartisan problem. We saw prosecution of leakers and whistleblowers under the Obama administration. And then there were more. This is not like a Democrat versus Republican thing. I think there's a lot of thinking going on, probably in newsrooms now. What will this new administration bring? And again, I'm not saying what I think will happen, but it's brought, I think, kind of renewed attention to it. I think, it's funny. I worked for The Intercept, which was back in 2014 to 16. And when I'd been freelance and working on books for a few years, and when I came back in 2014, particularly at The Intercept, where they were dealing with the Edward Snowden archive, they were like, here's your encrypted phone, here's your signal, here's your encrypted email. I was like loaded down with devices. And as people who know the history of The Intercept, that there were still, none of those devices save you. I think journalists always have to be aware of protecting sources, and there's probably no amount of technology that can protect sources. A lot of it is just making sure you don't put things down in places that could be vulnerable. I don't think there is any solution. I'm very skeptical of technology solutions of the threats to journalists. I think ultimately, it's going to come down, whether it's prosecution of whistleblowers or seeking journalist records, that's a government issue. If it's safety of journalists abroad, that is an issue of how other governments treat journalists. So we can be careful, we can try to amend our practices. I guess what I worry about, I worry that the threats to journalists get to the point, particularly abroad, where we're not bringing the reporting to light, to print, that we should be. I think that is a great danger as well.
Do you think the U.S. government can do more to protect, American journalists abroad, or be more, forceful if journalists are detained?
Well, let's take that beyond journalists. We've certainly seen and this is, again, across administrations. I think the Trump administration and then the Biden administration worked a lot to bring detained Americans. Unfortunately, I don't think these threats are unique to journalists. I think journalists are particularly at risk because, we can be used as tools, that they can claim, as they did completely unfairly in the case of the Wall Street Journal reporter accusing them of espionage. But we also saw Paul Whelan, who was also accused of espionage. I think the threats are broader than just journalists. I think we're a big part of it, and certainly I see it from the journalist perspective. I think, and this is, again, I'm good at problematizing, not on solutionism. How do you, I applaud what this administration what all administrations have done to bring home detained Americans. I think, unfortunately, as more Americans get detained, they become better at dealing with the problem. What nobody has figured out, and I don't have a solution there, how do you deter it? How do you stop it so that you're not in the position of negotiating or swapping assassins for journalists or from whoever? How do you stop it from happening in the first place? I don't have the solution there.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sharon. This has been great. great. And thanks. That's a wrap. Thanks to the entire NSI team, Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings for helping producing today's episode. There is a video, so this will be up on YouTube. Please be sure to watch the show. And if you like what you heard or saw, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you.